There's not necessarily treaties between, or historical colonial treaties between the British people and all of the Amerindian or indigenous groups that are in Guyana's interior, and that's just because there are mass many of them. When you look at how colonialism or how colonization happened, Guyana that we know today was colonized by the Dutch, and then it was colonized by the British. The Dutch way of doing colonization was to build roads that led to the mines and towards whatever resources they wanted to extract. So, for instance, my family lives in Guyana. We have one road, and if you follow that road all the way to the end, you know that you're going to a mine. That's just the Dutch way of doing colonialism. It was to get in, get the resources, and get out. The British, they more so had a type of settlement pattern way of doing resources where they settled in lands where they thought that the land was fertile for growing crops, having plantations and slaves over and indentured servants over, and they settled in that way. And so British settlement was much more dispersed. And also the British settlement, it never went as deep into Guyana as Dutch settlements did, precisely because, they feared diseases, they feared how much more development they would actually need to do or take on to clear out forests and stuff. And so many of the agreements were more so, we're not coming in that deep anyway, so we'll just leave you alone. And I think that that's important to point out because even though Burnham ended up being the independence leader in Guyana due to U.S. and UK interference, and there were many issues with Burnham's conception of socialism, if you could call it that, given his alliance with the United Forces Party, one thing that his goal, Burnham's goal with socialism did do in Guyana was that of states in South America and in the Caribbean, Guyana has some of the most progressive laws as it regards indigenous groups. And I know indigenous groups because I'm talking about Amerindian peoples and also maroon communities that are in Guyana and Suriname. But what that means is that a lot of those groups were allowed to be left alone and live as they live. And so you have a running joke in Guyana which says, well, of course we have the most progressive indigenous or laws in South America or in the Caribbean because Guyana doesn't develop itself, so it just so. But that is also a progressive way of interacting with or handling indigenous groups and communities is making sure that they can maintain their historical, traditional, and cultural ways of life and interacting as much or as little as they want to and on their terms. And so over the past 6 years, I would say you have seen indigenous groups in Guyana become more political and become more involved in politics, given coastal politics of extraction. And so when these indigenous groups, for instance, saw that ExxonMobil was there, you saw a lot of them coming into Georgetown, into the capital to say, if waters are poisoned up here, they're going to flow downstream and they're going to come into our communities and present a problem for us. And so they're able to do that only because there are clauses that grant them certain rights, saying that their lands are to be left alone as they are, and as long as they're maintaining the land. And again, there's questions of who gets to say how well or how bad they're maintaining the lands or not. He had bad experiments with this under Burnham, where he wanted to have all food production in Guyana be local. And so some indigenous communities were producing food, but there was never any real plan to get food from the interior to the capital. And so those food negotiations failed. But nonetheless, what it creates is a relationship between interior indigenous groups and coastal governments at the state level, where they could go and have complaints or some sort of interaction with the state. And so indigenous groups in Guyana, they're autonomous, so they have a lot of agency in the sense that the Guyanese state itself isn't necessarily going into the interior to develop the interior. And they also have a lot of rights that regard the maintenance of the land. So not only if they quote unquote destroy the land, but also if the land is being destroyed by the state, they can go and levy court grievances. And so actually one of the first cases levied against ExxonMobil in Guyana, so against ExxonMobil and the government, was by an indigenous boy from the Rufini, Savannah, and he was assisted by a black professor at Georgetown University there. And what he was saying is that ExxonMobil and oil to destroy the world away from Romania, and that was something that he wanted to address. And so this was also something that people have neglected in when we talk about Venezuela or Guyana tensions, is that the border in Essequibo is a bit porous, and indigenous groups talk and people talk in general. And so it is the case that many indigenous groups in Guyana view themselves as having more rights than indigenous groups in Venezuela. I think that today one of the biggest changes in the dispute, and I don't even like to call it a dispute because I do find Venezuela's claim to the Essequibo ridiculous. But I think that one of the biggest things that people are missing is that in the present, this isn't a tense situation because you have sort of imperial aligned governments in Venezuela making a claim to the Essequibo. What has changed is obviously the ideological positionings of both Venezuela and Guyana since this claim has been revived in the 60s. And that is that Venezuela is no longer a state that is aligned with U.S. and Western imperialism. And you see Guyana as a state that is more so welcoming to Western corporations and imperialism on its territory, given this oil find. And so that being said, I think one of the biggest issues in the conflict that people are neglecting or downplaying is Western intervention. In the present, this issue isn't because Venezuela has any issues with the internal politics of Guyana as being too communist or too left, but they're looking at sort of the internal situation in Guyana from a position that the state has been captured in Guyana. Something that has been annoying to me in the past few weeks is that Venezuela, in calling Guyana a captured state that they needed to, rescue through this annexation push, is that it failed to consult people in the Essequibo, and it also ignored or didn't pay any attention at all to Guyanese that have already been protesting against the government in Guyana. And this has been something that I've shared for weeks, and I guess for the past month since this tense situation has started prior to subsiding on the 14th. And it is now being alleged in Caribbean media that Maduro brought news clippings on the meeting for peace and dialogue on the 14th of Guyanese protesting the government and Exxon to basically say, see, my claims are founded. And again, just a very sloppy way of showing solidarity that I've been pointing out since day one. Like that's something very sloppy to do, because even prior to Venezuela's referendum, there has already been a crackdown on journalists and activists in Guyana that have been talking about the relationship between the government and Exxon. And him bringing those news clippings has now made it where all week we've seen the Guyanese government basically calling people treasonous and providing fodder and giving Venezuela Maduro ammunition for just protesting against Exxon. And so I'm not shocked that you don't find people in Guyana willing to talk about these things, precisely because Venezuela has made the internal dynamics in Guyana a lot more harder for activists that have, again, already been fighting against Exxon. And I know I veered off from the question, but yes, as I was saying, the main problem in the present that has started this whole contentious situation between Venezuela and Guyana is this issue of Western intervention. Venezuela is seeing that Guyana is being more welcoming or open to U.S. corporations and military exercise with Southcom, and they view that as an obvious threat because ever since October of 2021, the new Southcom general, Laura Richardson, she's been very vocal about the fact that she wants to institute regime change in Venezuela. And so that was part of the security concerns that I pointed out early on. And I also wrote about how hostile Richardson has been ever since she's assumed that post. And then, of course, you also have Guyana then being even more welcoming to Southcom, whereas they weren't at the beginning of this year, precisely because they view it as a way to deter Venezuela and its sort of annexation claims. And so now we have two states that were engaged in a dangerous security game that was sort of being egged on by, the chauvinists who, love Venezuela's position and believe somehow that Venezuela has this righteous claim to the Essequibo backed by Spanish colonialism. And then you also had sort of the righteous Guyanese nationalists who were more so like, if Venezuela intervenes, we obviously have a small army. So, of course, we should welcome the U.S. into the region. And so then what Venezuela feared which would have been Western intervention, would have happened anyway, given how sloppy it was behaving. And then what Guyanese on the ground fear, which would have been even more policing of their activisms against Exxon, would have become more likely. And so the December 14th meeting calmed those fears. And, we celebrate and we breathe a sigh of relief that diplomacy won out at the end of the day. And now we have to reckon with the aftermath of the fact that in Guyana it's going to be a lot harder to protest against ExxonMobil now, precisely because of how reckless Venezuela was in making these claims. Again, even prior to the December 3rd referendum in Guyana, especially earlier this year, there's been a crackdown on journalists and activists who've been very critical of the state's relationship with Exxon. You had a sort of rumored oil spill, and it was rumored, and then you heard that the government cleaned it up, but people didn't get any more information after that. So obviously that caused righteous outrage. It's also the case that some people have just lost their homes and their lands because of Guyana's past as a cooperative socialist republic. You can slate sort of land for development, and then since it's for the public interest, you can basically tell people this land is now being taken away by the state and they have to move elsewhere. And so the government has been instituting different schemes for Guyanese in Guyana and also Guyanese in diaspora, sort of get free land to build a house, but on the condition that that house or that land is being used more so in the interior and not on the sort of coastal regions that these oil corporations need to continue on in oil exploration and building pipelines to extract the oil that they find in the Starboard Block and elsewhere. And so you had protests against that where, land tenure, housing are all becoming bigger issues, and these have all been connected to Exxon. You also had a survey in February of this year where I think it was over 70% of Guyanese said that oil will not help them or development for the country. Around 13% of them said that they didn't know. So you have a vast majority of people in a country being told, you're the next Qatar, you're going to join the ranks of states like Saudi Arabia, where the majority of people are just like, no. I was there 2 years ago and I had a cousin tell me that they're like renting apartments in places for $10,000 US a month. And I thought that he was lying, but he drove me around and it was actually true. And so obviously there is this sort of distinction that is being clearly built in Guyana regarding us versus them. It makes it a bit more easier for people to protest because it's obviously like, why are all of these buildings going up for these people associated with oil? And then we're being policed or kicked out or told not to protest. And I think that that's also why you've seen a lot more people taking sort of the practices of Exxon and the relationship between ExxonMobil and the government to the courts. And that's also why in a lot of the court cases against Exxon in Guyana, you see the Guyanese government or the Guyanese Environmental Protection Agency listed as a co-defendant with Exxon. Like it is very clear to people that, the government is in some ways captured or is in cahoots with the sort of faulty types of development that Exxon is engaged in, and people viewing the deal as disastrous because Exxon is making billions and billions of dollars from oil in Guyana since 2019, and the Guyanese government has basically gotten some millions and are telling people to be satisfied with that. And so the fact that Guyana has the worst oil deal in the world is also something that is popularly or commonly known in Guyana. And so I situate all of these protests and all of these things to say that that was the situation in Guyana at the beginning of this year and into the summer. And now all of a sudden Venezuela does this referendum saying that people in Guyana are living in misery because the government is captured by ExxonMobil. And that's the first time Venezuela says anything about sort of the protest situation in Guyana. It never lent words of solidarity when Guyanese were protesting against Exxon. It never told the government that it shouldn't be cracking down on journalists or activists that are protesting against Exxon. Its literal first instance of even mentioning the fact that Guyanese are upset with its government is through this referendum that essentially says Venezuela wants to annex over half of the Guyanese territory. And it is Venezuela who has all of the know-how or wherewithal to extend contracts to people in these regions. And so then even Guyanese are like, but wait a minute, Venezuela just wants to use oil to exploit in the region. and they're upset at Guyana or mad that Guyana is doing it. And so then you have people who've been vocally against sort of the government and Exxon dealings, feeling as if they have to take this firm stance, saying, no, Guyana's territory is Guyana's territory. Let's share this, government clip or this Exxon clipping that essentially recognizes that this is Guyana's territory. And so in turn, what you have is that there's a push away from people protesting towards, as we saw in Venezuela, a type of nationalism in Guyana, where people were supporting and sharing, even on my social media, these nationalistic commercials with little children in Guyana saying, Essequibo is Rio. This is how many regions make up Guyana. This is where our borders are. And that's because people have this real fear of not wanting any sort of annexation to occur. People were very, I am Guyanese, I am not Venezuelan. And so you saw protests against Exxon and the government quiet down in favor of people sharing sort of nationalistic government videos and government quotes saying that, Guyana is Guyana. And so it had the exact opposite effect if Venezuela wanted to extend solidarity, which it didn't. That's why I called it chauvinist in its assertion, where people who were protesting the government and Exxon all of a sudden had to take a stand saying, wait a minute, we are Guyanese, this is Guyana, and we don't want Venezuela coming in. So again, the talks on December 14th, they really did sort of ease or calm tensions, but it really put it back to what it was pre the referendum. However, I don't think that we should downplay the sort of importance of those talks because the talks themselves established what is now known as the Joint Declaration of Argyle for Dialogue and Peace. And this is because important in those talks is the fact that Guyana and Venezuela both agreed that directly or indirectly, neither of them will threaten or use force against one another in any circumstances, including those consequential to any existing controversies between the two states. And to me, that was a firm denouncement of Western intervention, which, as I said in the beginning when we started this meeting, was what the major contradiction or the major invoking force for tension between the two states were, this notion of Western intervention. And so importantly, this talk is saying that the threat of force and the use of force will not happen no matter what between the two states. And it was always the case that Venezuela was never going to actually use force against Guyana. Throughout the history of Venezuela claiming that this dispute on the border exists, Venezuela has always used aggressive nationalist rhetoric. And part of that aggressive nationalist rhetoric has seen Venezuela occupy some parts of what is considered Guyana's territory. And it's also seen Venezuela move troops into Guyana's territory itself, but never actually declare war. And that is because of this notion of the region as a zone of peace, and also because even the sort of right-wing governments in Venezuela knew that Guyana's military is a very small military, and that if they ever were to engage in any sort of war or confrontation with Guyana, in the past, they would historically have to contend with Brazil, and Brazil saw itself as this sort of brother nation to Guyana, so that if Venezuela did have a, dispute on the borders, Brazil would have to intervene, since those three countries, Brazil, Venezuela, and Guyana, had agreed on their borders in the early 1900s. And so Venezuela always knew that confrontation with Guyana would bring in other regional members like Brazil and like Cuba that it did not want to have to confront. And in the present, I would say that because Venezuela views the United States as more of a military threat than it would of Brazil or Cuba, it still would not have ever made sense for Venezuela to use any force. And so this declaration about the threat of force and not using force is really just, again, an important step in Guyana, more or less denouncing the fact that it would have Western intervention being involved in any sort of regional conflict. And I do think that is very important. The declaration itself also reaffirms both states' stances as it regards the border. And so by this, I mean that Guyana, again, reaffirmed that it agrees with the United Nations Good Officers process that concluded in 2018, saying that if no resolution was reached, we are putting your case to UNSG said we're putting your case to the ICJ. So Guyana again affirmed the Geneva Agreement process by saying that it respects the ICJ as the means or the ends of where the dispute should be settled, and Venezuela rejected it. And so neither state compromised their position in that regard. Here, I would also note that you had a lot of misinformation going about saying, oh, Venezuela just wants to go back to the Geneva Agreement, but Venezuela does not want to go back to the Geneva Agreement because per the Geneva Agreement, then Venezuela would be consenting to UN Article 33, which says that the dispute should be settled at the ICJ, given both Ban Ki-moon and the current Secretary Guterres saying that that is the case. However, what Venezuela has done is use the Geneva Agreement to say because the Geneva Agreement exists, then this border is in dispute. And so I do also want to clear that up in this. And so again, neither state changed its position. Venezuela just wants to keep the Geneva Agreement alive to say that a dispute exists, but it doesn't actually want to settle or close the dispute since it would not be in Venezuela's favor. The main goal of the meeting was to ease tensions, given the kinds of war and invasion and intervention rhetoric and talks that were floating around. And in my view, this had to happen because it also allowed both leaders, Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela and also Irfan Ali in Guyana, to more or less save face. Because while Nicolas Maduro was being regarded as ridiculous to ignite this sort of border controversy that brings these two countries in a very hostile situation where Western intervention or the U.S. could get involved, Guyana was also saying very reckless things as well. Not necessarily Irfan Ali, but the vice president who has been the prime minister before, Jack Bayo in particular, he was the one saying that Guyana would be welcoming to a U.S. military base, be welcoming to U.S. military boots on the ground. And even today, he's sort of entertaining this prospect or this notion that a former general, I think his name is Wesley Clark, should become a sort of leader in the defense force or the defense apparatus in Guyana. And so he's been the one that's been mainly entertaining these stupid claims, which again stoke or inflame tensions. But I think that the meeting itself essentially put a hold on that. And so whereas they can both engage in any sort of lofty rhetoric that they want, they cannot threaten or use force given any of that engagement. And I think that that also dampens, those people who may have been cheerleading or wanting to see actual conflict to occur, since the agreement itself says that conflict won't occur and it won't be accepted in the region. Now, when we talk about this notion of zone of peace, again, it's a bit laughable because in the SDG meeting on the 14th, we've seen reports come out afterwards saying that they, stressed the need for mutual respect and the region standing as a zone of peace. And so the meeting on the 14th was a diplomatic success. However, what I want to note is that you had CARICOM and CELAC members there saying that the region is a zone of peace and it adheres to principles of non-intervention. But you have a lot of members in CARICOM and also in CELAC who are either today championing or either remaining silent when it comes to armed intervention in Haiti. And, if they can note at a meeting on the 14th that intervention and occupation, even when the stated end goal is peace, is anything but, I don't see how they don't see how that's hypocritical of them to stay or stress when they're advocating for armed intervention in Haiti. And so this zone of peace narrative has been a term that's been thrown around for the past month as it regards Venezuela and Guyana, again, given this sort of big holdover of Western intervention. But you don't see them adhering to these same principles in a way that is consistent or fair to states in the region. So again, you see that they advocate for armed intervention in Haiti, and even throughout the region's history, you've seen some states support invasion, even if they'll just leave a meeting talking about the zone of peace. And so I think that the region as a whole needs to be much more politically astute or more educated on what solidarity looks like, what non-intervention means, and what mutual respect means. Because when we use it in sort of fickle ways like this, people can always call out hypocrisy, and I think that we should expect hypocrisy to be called out, especially if it concerns Haiti in this state. So I think that your question is probably more so leaning towards something that I guess you could say people in Venezuela have been championing, which is this notion of, is there a possibility for joint governance between Guyana and Venezuela and Essequibo, or is it just the case that people in Essequibo fail to recognize either state and want some sort of own self-liberation? Uh, and I will tell you, just as I told Tenement Y'all the other day, that any notion for joint governance, you know, it ended when Chavez died. I think that he would have been a person in a better situation, which would have, helped Guyana develop any sort of oil capacity that it had found if it had existed when he was alive and at the height of his political career in Venezuela. And also uh, now under Maduro, uh, a lot of people in Guyana view him as unnecessary, igniting tensions at random points in time. And so I don't think that any sort of joint governance situation between the states is possible. And it's also the fact that the majority of people living in the Essequibo do identify as Guyanese. And so then if any joint governance would work, you have people then probably complaining or somehow calling Venezuelan settlers for even going into the Essequibo for there to try to be some sort of even semblance of democracy. And so that wouldn't necessarily work. The Essequibo region in Guyana is a very interesting region given how diverse it is. You have indigenous groups that are Amerindian and also Maroon communities and societies. You also have Black people. You also have some Indian people. You also have Asians, Chinese in the Essequibo. And so even though a lot of people talk about Essequibo being sparsely populated, since over 90% of Guyana's population lives on the coast, the Essequibo region is a lot more diverse than even sort of the coastal region of Georgetown, just because of how many different types of people live in it. Uh, that being said, I think that there's about 14 or 15 indigenous groups in the Essequibo. And I think of those 14 or 15, about 10 of them are officially recognized by Guyana. And when I say officially recognized, I mean that they actually engage in Guyanese politics, or Guyana has a point person who's able to communicate with them in their languages. And to my knowledge, almost all 10 of those indigenous groups have put out statements basically saying that they recognize the territory to be their territory. And as far as they know, the only government that they ever see or recognize in that territory is Guyanese. Um, you have other groups who are more so just border groups, so they're either in Brazil or in Guyana or Venezuela. And I don't think that anyone ever got any sort of direct or clear statements from those groups. There's also been a lot of misinformation that reached inhabitants of the Essequibo. So my family lives in the interior of Guyana, so we also occupy or are a part of that sort of Essequibo region, which Venezuela would claim. And prior to this referendum, we always say like, oh, the government doesn't really come here, state services don't really reach us, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like that's a constant complaint. But even we still view or recognize the Guyanese government over the Venezuelan government. And something that I think is interesting is that when this whole referendum started, you saw politicians going into the interior communities and coming into the Essequibo to basically do this sort of nationalist rhetoric. Guyana is ours. You all are Guyanese. We're going to protect you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that was, you know, the kind of only information that we got. So I had family members asking me, is Venezuela about to invade or intervene? And just some of the statements that I saw, some of the Amerindian communities put out saying that they will defend themselves by any means necessary, and they hope Guyana will defend themselves by any means necessary as well. I think that there was an information gap that reached the Essequibo community, so that you had a lot more people there thinking like, oh my God, Venezuela is about to come in. And so again, sort of a lack of information and how people identify as being Guyanese, that you had people who were more so afraid of Venezuela coming in and afraid of a war happening uh, in the region in general. And so I think that that in itself, that information gap also shows sort of the deficiencies of the Guyanese government and, you know, reaching out to local populations, and also again just exacerbates what I pointed out before, in that Venezuela never consulted people. And so now you have an instilled fear that was created about Venezuela potentially coming in, coupled with a lack of information or precise information from the government, that made people in Essequibo more confused than anything about why there was conflict or why these tense situations existed in the first place. And so when talking about self-determination or how people should just live their lives, I think that people just want to go back to a sense or time of peace where they felt like they were just being able to live their lives without having to worry or care about anyone coming in. Something that's also important to note about the interior communities in Guyana and also in the Essequibo is that they'd largely be opposed to any sort of U.S. or Western intervention. And so the kinds of messaging that even the Guyanese government had to do when it went into interior communities to talk about how it would protect itself or encourage others to protect itself, you didn't have them mentioning like, oh, the U.S. is going to come and back us, because that would be largely unpopular. Because again, you have indigenous communities there, you have their own communities there, and they associate, you know, they associate white people with imperialism and colonialism. That's just how it is. That's the last time you saw a bunch of white people. You can talk to my grandmother, and she'll tell you the first time she saw a white person, she thought it was a ghost. And so these relations are not as clearly investigated as they should have been by either the Guyanese government or the Venezuelan government, and had sort of people in a panic or in a sense of fear in the Essequibo. And I think that that's a situation that today they're happy is no longer the case given the dialogue that happened. So I do think that the U.S. is shifting its focus. And again, I think that this was apparent when Richardson was made the head of Southcom. So it was actually earlier this year, around February and March time, that she actually gave a press conference, or I don't even know why these Southcoms do these like interview type of things. And she was basically saying that they would have to convince the Guyanese people that, you know, a U.S. base would be in their interest, right? So she's saying that in February, March of this year. Now you have this whole referendum in Venezuela, and now the Guyanese government is saying, well, wait a minute, maybe we do need to have a U.S. military base in Guyana for our own defense. And when she said this in February or March, she was talking about how reckless Venezuela was and how Venezuela was this harbinger of regional insecurity in the region. And so I think that the U.S. is strategically seeking out a base in the region, and not only a base in the region, but it wants it to be in a more stable state. And so, you know, Guyana is where CARICOM's headquarters are. Guyana is, you know, a landed and it's quite sizable Caribbean country. And so it would make sense for that. And while she made the focus in that talk on Venezuela and competitors like China, I think that the U.S. interest in the Caribbean region is majorly increasing because of how CARICOM views itself as competing with China in the region for resources. And not only that, but of CARICOM states, Guyana is China's number one trading partner. And so Guyana, I think for Southcom, would, you know, knock out two birds with one stone. You have the U.S. base there to, you know, help do the regime change that Richardson wants to do in Venezuela. And two, they'd also combat what they view as undue Chinese influence in the Caribbean. Now, what better way to do it than to have a base in the country who's the largest trading partner with China? I also think because of Guyana's relationships in its development, because you also have Chinese exploration companies in Guyana for the petroleum as well, because of Guyana's relationship, that's why Guyana has not taken any sort of hard stance on 100% being open or accepting to U.S. bases or boots on the ground ever since February or even now. A U.S. military base in Guyana would be largely unpopular, especially in this climate of protest against U.S. corporations like Exxon in Guyana. So Guyana is not the most quote-unquote stable place because it would be unpopular, but Guyana would be the ideal place given its position in the region, not only as, you know, CARICOM's headquarters are there, so you'd have a direct influence in CARICOM that way. You'd also have Venezuela next door, and you want regime change, and then, of course, the China competition angle. Whereas the current government assumed its position after the elections in 2020 or 2019 after the no confidence vote. And they called on, Mike Pompeo, who wanted to sanction the former AFNO-PNC alliance government for not giving away power as easily or not doing easy transitions, and he was going to sanction them. The PPP government that is currently in power was sort of welcoming to that, but even they, like the government before them, didn't sort of consent to broadcasting messages into Venezuela that Southcom wanted them to broadcast into. And so I think in that sense, Guyana is trying to play a more so ideologically neutral actor. But of course, you cannot be an ideologically neutral actor when you have undue corporate influence in your country. And I think that that's what Venezuela is pointing out. And so in order to sort of push some of those claims back, Guyana has been more vocal about, wanting partnerships with China, about wanting partnerships with Saudi Arabia, about wanting partnerships with a bunch of other different countries to sort of diversify its sort of corporate, diversified corporate portfolio in Guyana. But even that is also a risky game as well, because you have it where some U.S. corporations wouldn't want other corporations working in and partnering with the Guyanese government in Guyana. And so it's a risky development game that Guyana is playing, but Guyana is playing it because it knows that it is being screwed out of the ExxonMobil deal. It also knows that ExxonMobil is increasing tensions between itself and its neighbors. And it also knows that ExxonMobil is the reason why the U.S. is expressing sort of undue defense interest in Guyana. And I don't think that any Guyanese political party, would want it to have been on their watch that a U.S. intervention or a U.S. base was created in the country. I think that would be a permanent stain on that party's record, even more so than the stain of all of these parties have veered away from, the sort of communist or socialist they had historically.